Welcome to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. In today's episode, we are diving into a conversation on faith and culture. What kind of posture can Christians have towards culture? Should Christians engage, run away, or even embrace culture? What would it mean to redeem culture? And how has the TikTokification of culture changed the way young people engage pop culture today? These are all questions I'll be talking about with our special guest, Justin Bailey. So stay tuned for another great episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Justin Bailey to the podcast. Dr. Bailey is the professor and chair of the Theology department at Dordt University, where he navigates the intersections of theology, culture, and ministry. His writings have appeared in publications like Christianity Today, Christian Scholars Review, and the International Journal of Public Theology. As the author of Reimagining Apologetics and Interpreting Your World, Dr. Bailey has challenged and inspired many with his deep reflections on faith in our contemporary world. Beyond academia, he is also an ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church with diverse pastoral experiences serving in Filipino-American, Korean-American, and Anglo-American communities. And he is here with us today. So thank you, Justin. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, it's so good to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So help us get to know you a little bit better. Where did you grow up and what was your religious background and upbringing like?
Yeah. So my parents met and married in the Philippines, where my father was in the Peace Corps. My mother was his language teacher. They met and they married over there, and then they moved to the States, where I was born, and I grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Illinois, grew up in Kansas, outside of Kansas City on the Kansas side, and I grew up in a faithful Christian home. I was in a Baptist church, pretty, maybe I hesitate to use the word fundamentalist, but we only use the King James Version of the Bible. We had, some strict, cultural norms around things like dancing and going to movies. So I guess you could maybe describe it as pietistic, at least in that sense. Culture denying, I'd say, in another sense. But I definitely fell in love with Jesus in that context, and wanted to serve God however I could, which led me to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, where I was working on a degree in applied linguistics because I wanted to be a Bible translator. There was some romance in that aspiration, the idea of going into a tribe and translating the Bible and that sort of thing. And so though I did graduate with a linguistics degree, I sort of knew by the time I graduated that I probably wasn't going to be a Bible translator, though I still did want to be on the mission field in a foreign context. At the same time, I had started serving in a local Filipino congregation in Chicago, where I was working with a pretty diverse urban youth group of all different sorts of students from all public, private, Christian school, and our common, so all different ethnicities, and our kind of common connection was popular culture in that context. I moved on from there to work at a Korean-American church as an English-speaking pastor for 7 years, and worked in that immigrant context in Chicago as well, in the Chicago suburbs. And then while I was there, I was running into, questions that I didn't feel like I had great answers for. So I went back to school. For a second time, I had gotten a Master's of Divinity from Trinity Divinity School, and then got a Master's of Theology in just a desire to sharpen my tools a bit. And one thing led to another, and I ended up doing a PhD at Fuller in Los Angeles. So then I was serving there in a PCA church in Pasadena, California, as a teaching pastor, and really thinking I was going to continue to be just in the church in an urban area, and an opportunity open to come to Dordt. And that was 8 years ago. So that's where I've been since then.
That's amazing. That's a great story. You've really gone all over the country in your story. I
Yeah,
have the
the
connect.
classic Chicago to Los Angeles to Iowa,
Yeah,
trajectory that
right.
people are always on. Yeah.
It's the normal trajectory for most young aspiring Bible translators.
That's right.
The Bible translating story, it kind of reminds me of like, I feel like, well, first, so I went to Moody as well for
Oh,
my
wow.
undergrad. So we
Oh,
have
great.
that in connection. I was a theology major, but I think one of the things about Moody's environment there and the culture there that I think really is powerful for helping to cultivate young missionaries is that it just gets a hold of 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who do
Mhm.
have that kind of desire for adventure to go out, that kind of romanticized. And there's something, that of course could be dangerous with that, sending out someone maybe who doesn't have the right motivations or awareness of what it's actually going to take. But there's also something I think there's a gift in young people going in those directions, and I think that's great. So yeah, I was at Moody, and then I also graduated from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School as
Okay.
well.
Wow. Well, we have a
So we
lot
have
there
a
in
lot of
common.
connections. Yeah. Um, so that's great. So what do you teach at Dordt? What's your kind of main classes?
Yeah, so in recent years, have gravitated towards teaching large core classes. So core would be general classes that every student has to take. We think of it as sort of a worldview type minor that every student has to take. So it's not just your general ed, it's sort of a worldview core. And so I've gravitated towards teaching a lot of upper level core electives. So I teach classes like Christianity and pop culture, aesthetics, beauty, imagination, and the arts, Christian ethics, classes that draw not just from theology majors, but from the general student body to help them as they go out graduating from Dordt into the world, encountering the complexities of culture and yeah, cultural agency as they go out, helping them to be, yeah, that maybe that missionary thread still goes through everything I do. That desire to evangelize every aspect of life, not just every part of
Mhm.
the world, but everything we do to have that be robustly informed by Christian theology and the gospel of Jesus Christ. So yeah, I teach biblical foundations like we all do for every student, but most of the classes that I teach are for the general student body and upper level electives. I do teach a few theology classes that are kind of pastoral ministry oriented, or mission and ministry, leadership and discipleship, because I was a pastor for over a decade.
Mhm.
So I do teach those sorts of classes as well. But yeah, most of my load now, my faculty teaching load is oriented around cultural engagement and the sorts of things I write about.
That's great. You mentioned that pop culture theology class, and you being a youth pastor back in the day in Chicago, and I was. We have all these connections, but I was also a youth pastor in Chicago for a while, and when I was a youth pastor, and maybe you felt similarly, I felt completely inadequate to connect with these kids. Even though I was not that much older than them, I
Yeah.
felt like, man, these kids are just in a totally different world than I was at their age. And but pop culture was kind of like is the doorway in. Like it's like if I can learn their music, if I can learn like
Yeah.
what they like to buy, then maybe I'll be able to teach them something about Jesus in the process. Um, so what is it what is it like in for your college students? What kind of what seems to be the big I don't know if issues in pop culture or like
Mhm.
topics in pop culture that tend to come up like for these college students?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think that you mentioned that about having a hard time connecting to youth group students, and I was right there with you. It felt very clumsy.
Hmm.
but well-intentioned. And I'm sure that, they were, if they weren't embarrassed, they sort of thought, oh, it's cool that he's trying to connect with me in some way. I still feel that way with college students now. I mean, obviously the gap has widened, if anything. And I recognize the fact that many of the cultural artifacts I'm most interested in are things that were formative for me in the late 90s and early aughts. And they don't really know what they are, and so I have to continually kind of try to stay up to date in what's going on, which is challenging. The other thing that makes it challenging, and this is a shift I've really seen in the last, I'd say, 5 years or so, is students are actually consuming less pop culture in the traditional sense, in terms of watching streaming shows, listening to music. The TikTok, what's the word? How would I turn this into a word? TikTokification of popular culture, which is
Uh-huh.
kind of shrunken content down into these, 60-second bits of culture, means that students are much more likely to spend a lot of time getting those sort of dopamine hits of going from one piece of one clip to another, rather than actually they feel like it's an incredible investment to watch a full season of a show or to listen to a
Hmm.
whole album. And so there's been this fragmentation, I think, especially, um, that I often sort of thought of myself as trying to get students who are very immersed in popular culture artifacts to appreciate what we might call high culture, or like the best of the best,
Hmm.
And now I feel like I'm trying to just get students to move from this more fragmented way of consuming media to actually watch any pop culture at all, just because of the time that um, it gives you to build a narrative and a story and characters, and it's kind of humanizing, actually.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that's a challenge that I think that we face. It's not that students aren't um, consuming popular culture if they're consuming it in these much smaller doses designed to elicit the sort of dopamine hit, and that it's also become very niche and fragmented so that there is no common currency almost. It's very rare that I can find something that everybody watches or that everybody listens to. I mean, even someone like Taylor Swift, people have really strong opinions about her one way or the other. And so, yeah, I think that's been a challenge, is that there is no longer a shared. That was the thing, pop culture was the thing that connected
Hmm.
my youth group at the Filipino church. They're Puerto Rican and Indian American and Caucasian, and yet they all sort of listened to the same music and had things like that. And I found with my college students that there's no longer that common currency, and so it's much more difficult to have those conversations because of the contested and fragmented nature in which we consume media.
That's really fascinating. So I was recently reading Bob Dylan's autobiography. And in that book, he talks about because his some of his songs are like 12, 13 minutes long.
Mhm.
And people, would always have a problem with that because like, how are you going to get a 13-minute song on the radio? And he writes about this dilemma that it didn't bother him at all to have like 18 verses in each one of his songs. He just like that's the way he wrote. He loved telling stories like that. And he said, we've moved from a culture that can listen to long orchestral pieces that would go
Mhm.
on for like 30 or 45 or
Yeah.
an hour at a time. And he says we've moved to become a 3-minute culture, which is a radio song.
Mhm.
And it seems like you're saying is like it's like, and now we've gone another step where it's like we're really like a 12-second culture. Like it's like the TikTok videos. Um, yeah, there is no development in the story, and it usually is, at least the ones that I've seen, it's predominantly, and I could be wrong with this, seems like predominantly to be like about making you laugh. Like that's the goal of a lot of these videos,
Mhm.
which is, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just is, it seems to be a big thing.
Yeah, I've had discussions. We have discussions all the time in that class about, I'm in a Reformed tradition that really is looking to redeem, everything human that we can find. And
Hmm.
so how far is too far, though? Are there elements of technology that are, because of their structure, irredeemable or not worth your time, and certainly
Mm,
that's always been the case with particular pieces of content that are not worth your time. But whole media, like TikTok itself, so there is um, a technology called Yik Yak, which is sort of an
mm,
anonymous location-based posting service. But because of its anonymity, it brings out the very worst in people. And so I'd say like technology like that, I'm not sure that is redeemable. I'm not sure it's worth
mhm.
having, somebody spend their time evangelizing anonymous people on Yik Yak. And TikTok's probably more complicated. I'm sure there are people who are using that virtuously, but there are things about the very structure of delivery that shape our brains in particular ways
Mhm.
that are deformative potentially to our discipleship. And I think that's part of discerning culture is not just discerning content, but also the way that we take the content in and what that does to us along the way.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's I had a friend of mine, she was in an MFA program for creative writing, and she came she was kind of newer to the Reformed tradition and that this whole idea you're talking about redeeming all things, and how we don't have to throw away things, we don't have to damn things, that so much of life can be redeemed for good. And one thing she said to me one time was in her MFA program, she did, she read all kinds of novels of all kinds.
Mhm.
And her comment was, I really do think a lot of literature is whether um, it has a redemptive arc or not, or it can be redeemed. But she said, but there were certain pieces that I read in my program that were so evil feeling that they did not seem redeemable. And she said, like, um, it was just so dabbling in the most grotesque of things.
Mhm.
Um, and she says, I have a hard time with seeing how that can be redeemable. So I think that's an important part um, of discerning within the
Mhm.
Reformed tradition. Is like, what's the limits
Yeah.
to what is redeemable?
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think it's also important, we all have different sensitivities and
Hmm.
sensibilities, and we are part of a church. So not every single person needs to have the same sense of limits, right? And I think that we need to keep each other anchored. Sometimes I have students who are like, oh, well, this you're giving me free license to go do whatever I want, and to go watch whatever I want, oh, I'm discerning culture, and I think that probably if you're thinking about that way, you're already off on the wrong foot. But I think
Mm,
it's important to recognize that I think there are some people that do have callings to engage specific genres or specific yeah, cultural areas, we might say. So, like the horror genre is not one that I spend very much time in, but I do know of some very deeply committed Christians who do spend quite a bit of time in the horror genre. They say like that genre is the genre of non-denial. That is the genre in which it acknowledges the spiritual realm. It acknowledges the realness of evil in a way
mhm,
that other genres don't. And I'm very thankful that they're willing to do that work and to sift through some of that for the rest of us. But I don't think everyone needs to do that. And I don't think all of my students need to do that. And I'm not trying to
mhm,
get my students to sin against their conscience, by engaging in or going further than they're comfortable doing. I also think that we need to the degree that we go out further into culture, especially in spaces that are contested or that we feel that darkness, the deeper we need to go in devotion. So our roots need to go deeper
mm,
as we go out further. Otherwise, it's easy to be uprooted as you get out further in those places. So
mm.
I think staying connected to the church, local congregation, especially, but also other believers, and doing this work of discernment together, and then also making sure that we are not that you were staying connected in devotion to the Lord and under the authority of his word, even as we go and seek to listen and learn and patiently engage what's going
Mhm.
on in culture and popular culture specifically.
Yeah, I think doing that work in isolation is always a risky endeavor. But when we welcome others in and we're in a community about it and talking about it, it can alleviate maybe some of the um, um, I don't know what the word would be, some of the dangers that can come with going into things that might be pushing your conscience or might be going to places you're not used to. Um, I remember the writer Anne Lamott. She says to her Sunday school kids each year, the best lesson or the secret to life is to read lots of books and to not keep bad secrets. And her whole thing is like this sense of like, yeah, when we are in the midst of evil of any kind, and if we keep it all to ourselves, it can harm us. But when we open up about it, it can transform it. Um, so I think that's really really wise. Well, let's jump into a bit of your book, Interpreting Your World: Five Lenses for Engaging Theology and Culture. First off, thank you for writing this book. I found it, I just finished it. Well, actually, I finished the last little bit of it this morning, and I found it to be such a refreshing read on engaging culture because um, it was engaging it in a way I had not seen it put quite before with your five different lenses. And I found that to draw me in on all these different ways of thinking about something. Um, and so I was just wondering if we can start by, I mean, obviously all we've already talked about probably has influenced this book, but was there something in particular, um, or some situation that really caused you to write this particular book?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that when I set out to write the book, it was because I felt like books on theology and culture were either up here in the clouds, 30,000 feet, doing a lot of the important conceptual work, um, theology of culture, why we can care about culture, things like that. Or they were very particular about very particular cultural artifacts. And of course, the hard thing about writing a book about a cultural artifact is by the time that it goes through the publication process, it's outdated already, right?
Hmm.
People have moved on to something else. And so, if you write a book about whatever, The Bear or something like that, a show that's very popular these days, by the time it comes out, people might have moved on. And so I was trying to write a book that split the difference so that was not all the way up here just doing theory, but at the same time was not just about very specific cultural artifacts. So that's what I was trying to do, to shoot for the middle in some
Hmm.
ways. It's a book that I'm using obviously in the college classroom, a book I was looking for a book like this. And so I, decided to write, to try my hand at writing it. I think also that just maybe more broadly, I've told you a bit about my story, and yeah, I grew up in majority white context as a Filipino-American, and I think that a big part of my academic work has to do with me getting a sense of what does it mean to belong to Christ as my deepest identity, while also feeling all these other layers of belonging, right? Of, my ethnic or cultural or racial identity, where I was raised, the family I was raised in, and what does it mean to integrate all these things together in a coherent life in obedience to God. And so that's really, I think, what my life is about, or my scholarly vocation is about, is to help pull together things that sometimes we pull apart. And so that's what I was trying to do in this book. Is I felt like a lot of times when I see people engaging culture or talking about culture, they tend to have just one sort of tool. And so they tend to only see one sort of thing, So outside the walls of the church, the primary lens that people are using is usually the power lens, right? They're understanding culture in terms of, well, who is winning, who's being oppressed, that, who's being marginalized. And that's a really important lens. Obviously, I have a whole chapter in the book about that, the power lens, but it's also not the only lens for understanding what's going on in the world. I mean, more is going on in the world than just people having power over each other.
Hmm.
You can't really explain an ordinary day in most people's lives if you only have the power lens and the sorts of things that I'm just doing to live and survive and make a life with my community that is beautiful. So within the walls of the church, it feels like the ethical lens is the primary lens that people use when they relate to culture, which is a lens of like, well, what's right, what's wrong, who's right, who's, in that sense, should we watch this, should we not watch this? And again, a very important lens. I have a whole chapter about it. But again, not the only lens. And so what I was trying to do is to bring together five dominant ways of thinking about culture from disciplines like cultural anthropology, critical theory, ethical reflection, religious studies, and aesthetics, and say, okay, all of these different ways of looking at culture should be integrated together. And if we only use one lens, then we're going to not see so much of what's going on in God's world. So I'm looking for a non-reductive, non-dismissive, and non-anxious approach to cultural engagement, which is why I wrote the book.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, what is, I want to dive in into the chapter on the religious dimension,
Mhm.
even though I'm tempted to go to the power dimension that you just mentioned, because I think there's so much there. But for the sake of time, I really want to
Yeah.
just dive into this chapter. So it's called The Religious Dimension, Culture as Sacred Experience. So what do you mean when you say culture as sacred experience?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, when you talk about the religious dimension, the most common way to think about that is in terms of traditional religion. So the connections between culture and religion have often been made. Sometimes they're substituted for one another. There is a religious dimension to everything culturally that we do. That's something that has been said in the Reformed tradition for quite a long time, even that culture is religion, in that it's always oriented or offered towards God, or towards our sense of what or who God is. I was also trying to, in this chapter, talk about the way that we live religiously. And I always note that my students, when I ask them, tell me about a piece of pop culture that has been important to you, almost always within the first 3 minutes of that going around the room and sharing, somebody will say, "Oh yeah, I watch that show religiously," or
Hmm.
"Oh, I follow the Minnesota Vikings religiously, and they always lose, but we always," and then the way they describe their fandom of that team is very rich, almost ritualistic. We always,
Mhm.
the same time, we wear the same ceremonial dress and we eat the same ceremonial food, and it's like uh yeah, a religious practice. And I always stop them in the middle of it and I say, okay, you just said, why didn't you say regularly? And they think for a second, it's like, well, regularly is accurate, but it doesn't capture everything about it. Religiously is the right word because it
Mhm.
expresses both the regularity of it, but also a sort of depth of commitment to it. So when I talk about the religious dimension of culture, I'm not just talking about traditional practice of religion, or the fact that culture is religious in the sense that it's oriented towards God or away from God. I'm also talking about a more ordinary way of thinking about religious practice in which particular rituals orient our lives towards community, uh, give us a sense of transcendence, of sacred experience. You think about going to a concert or going to a sporting event, watching the Olympics. I mean, think of the Olympics as a religious practice, regardless of all of the stuff about the opening ceremony. If none of that had ever happened, there is a religious dimension to what's going on with the Olympics right now, that we're all sort of uh, together coming around some sort of central thing that gives us feelings of transcendence. It makes us feel like we are caught up in something bigger than ourselves, bigger than our own tribal identities or national identities, um, that allows us to feel some sense of fullness, some sense
Mhm.
of that we're caught up in something greater. So that's what I'm after in this chapter on the religious dimension, is this natural propensity that we as humans have to seek something more um, than what is. And so in this sense, culture is one to understand culture as a religious or sacred experience is to understand the way that culture allows us to cope with the anxieties of life and the certainty of death.
Hmm.
So in that sense, a lot of people, go to church on Sunday or go to synagogue or go to mosque as a way of coping with the anxieties of life and the certainty of death. But there's a lot of who would call non-religious people for whom something like watching USC football, or Stanford, right? Um, is their religious experience. Like that is their community. That is um their source of transcendence, the way of that they cope. And that they feel that, yeah, I will die, but this football team will live on, or whatever it is. And yeah, and so that's what I'm interested in, is the way that we live religiously. Because if now we can talk about life and culture as religious practice, well, now the Bible has a lot to say about that, about religious practice, faithful and unfaithful. And I both want to affirm that impulse, which I think is an impulse to revelation. I think that it is, yeah, this thing that God has carved in our soul, that we naturally have this desire to cultivate religious communities, and to seek transcendence. And then I also think it can be one of the worst things we do, because then, yeah, it's also a way that we try to avoid God, um, by creating substitutes for God. And that's what we talk about when we talk about idolatry. So yeah, so that's what I'm going for in that chapter.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It reminds me of a recent conversation I heard between Derek Thompson, who's an author for The Atlantic, and I believe it was Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Coddling of the American Mind.
Mhm.
And he was talking about research that's been done about why there's the stats that say that Democrats are often, or Republicans are happier than Democrats, just in general. This was this research they were talking about, and it kind of cracked me up, hearing about this, and I was listening to it. But one of the things that they found in the research was Republicans are more likely to be part of a religious group, and then he said, but it's not just you're more happy if you're part of a religious group. It's actually if you're practicing and devoted. So like it's not just like, hey, I'm a Christian, but
Mhm.
going to church every Sunday actually makes you a happier person.
Mhm.
And as a pastor, I'm like, hey, everyone should listen to this.
Yeah.
But no, it was just kind of a reminder of this idea of like, there's something about religious practices, and we can substitute that for, different experiences in culture, but they
Yeah.
actually help us like real time in this life to cope
Mhm.
with the difficulties. And I found that to be, yeah, a really fascinating part of this chapter because it's so helpful.
Yeah, and the thing that we want to ask about any kind of religious practice is how thick is it? And something like building a community around a television show, or building a community around
Mm,
your fandom of a particular musical artist. I mean, and there's this really interesting sense, I think, it's always seeking to go further. How far can it go? If it connects me to this global community of fans, but maybe there's some local chapters, local meetups, that naturally we desire to have that, an ever thickening connection, religious connection, whatever is in the center. But the question is, whatever it is that we're putting in the center, is it enough to organize a
mm,
life? And is it enough to truly console in the face of life's anxieties? And is it enough to actually console in the face of death? And what you find with most of the things that we put in that religious center, it's not thick enough. It's not meant to be something that organizes a religious life. And I think that same thing with merely having a religious identification as a Christian, but not actually engaging in the practices of Christian faith, not actually putting your life on the line in terms of practices in interdependent community. Yeah, it's not going to be thick enough as a brand.
mhm,
The brands are not thick enough to organize a human life and to comfort us in the face of all that life can give and all that death can take. But an actual religious faith might be able to do
mm.
that. But that again would require you, yeah, putting your life on the line in practices and in community. And I think we naturally both desire that, but also fear it because of the claim that it makes on us.
Do you think um, we're confronted with either the thickness or thinness of um, depending, like when we face death itself? Like if you have a family member or a friend or something, you know, die,
Mhm.
the things you do rely on are either going to help you in that moment or they're not.
Yeah.
And so do you find like that is one of the key parts of like understanding how really thick your religious culture is?
I think certainly, yeah. I'm being reminded of we had a student who passed away a few years ago, and at his memorial, there it wasn't the memorial service, but it was a time on campus that we gave to remember.
Hmm.
And one of the things that stuck out to me was how often people mentioned how much the student loved Marvel movies.
Mm,
And in one sense, you think, why would something so trivial be mentioned in such a sacred place? But I thought it was actually a really good illustration of the importance of these what we might think of as non-traditional sources of consolation,
mm,
the Marvel movies, even with, their embedded theology and, whatever you think about them as a cultural product, these movies meant something to this student and his friends.
mhm,
And I think that that should give us something to think about, right? And I think as well, when you consider any kind of religious practice, ultimately asking the question of what is the comfort that it gives us in life and death? And is it merely distracting me from thinking about my death, which is, that's another huge school of cultural interpretation, Ernst Becker's denial of death, who argued that the primary purpose of culture is to keep us from thinking about our death, or to help us transcend our death through these hero projects that we make. But I think there is this real sense in which I would say God's Spirit is actually at work in seeking better soil for us to plant our hopes in, as we realize that the things that we've placed our hopes in can give us some comfort, but not really enough in the
mm,
face of in the face of life and death.
mhm. And I think too, when it comes to our own religious practices within our faith community as Christians, one thing I've noticed that when Christians are faced with death and um, people remind them of like what they believe, like, hey, it's um, trying to comfort them in their grief by saying something like, well, we're so great. Well, at least we know that he will rise with Christ or she will rise with Christ, something like that, which is like a true belief
True.
of
Yeah.
the Christian faith, but is actually doesn't do much for the person in that moment of grief. And so talk a little bit about the difference between like in your mind in the difference between beliefs like our doctrine and our practices and like how they affect us differently.
Yeah, that's a big question. Uh,
Yeah, it might be
you
too
know,
big, but
yeah, because you have beliefs as sort of what I would say grounding dispositions towards the world, things that we think are true about the world. We have practices in which we both perform the things that we believe, but also that are the expression of our belief. There's this, yeah, there's this real sense. I say at the end of the book, your interpretation is not what you think. It's not what you believe. It's how you live. So don't
mm,
tell me about your interpretation of the passage. Show me, and like that's what James says, right? Like show me your interpretation of the image of God in the way you treat your neighbor. Don't just tell me like, well, it could be functional or it could be ontological. That's important to know those things,
mhm,
but the way you actually live is your theology, right? Is the way that you live it out. And so that's where I'd say that practices are the place where we put our lives on the line. We actually live out our faith. We demonstrate what we believe. And of course, those are always connected to those grounding dispositions, because it is because I have this faith that I seek to live in a particular way. Um, but practices also enable us to be faithful when we don't feel our faith, when the certainty or the confidence that we wish we had um, is not there, or when we
mhm,
cannot bring ourselves to pray, um, the practices, it's almost like you're being held up by somebody else's faith. In entering in and worshiping with other believers, or taking the Lord's Supper, or praying through a prayer book, reading the Psalms, like all of these things are ways in which we connect to the larger body of Christ. And yeah, I always kind of talk about it in terms of um, like when I say to my wife, "Hey, can you remind me to call the dentist?" Or I say it to my phone, maybe, yeah, Siri, remind me to call the dentist. It extends my cognition, it extends my memory beyond my own head. And similarly, when I practice my faith with other believers, it extends my faith out beyond my own weak apprehension of the world and of reality, and allows me to be held up in some sense by others with whom I'm practicing my faith with. And I think that's part of what I mean by saying that there's a thickness and a thinness, and part of that thickness is the historicity of traditional religious faith and the historicity of Christianity. And things like saying the Apostles' Creed or taking the Lord's Supper, these historic practices that connect us beyond our own puny apprehension of what is true and real to some much larger um, truth that has been apprehended and experienced by people from every tribe and tongue and nation across time and space. There's a thickness to that, that yeah, that no pop culture artifact can compete with,
Mm.
in some sense.
Mm. So speaking of practices, I really appreciate how at the end of every chapter you give a practice um, for people to kind of think about and to try out in their own lives. And the one at the end of the religious dimension chapter is called directional discernment. So could you just say a little bit about what directional discernment is?
Yeah. Their practices, they're also postures,
Mhm.
because it's a sense of what direction you're oriented, I think, in all the chapters. But directional discernment is an idea that comes from the Dutch missiologist J.H. Bavinck. It's also a deeply reformed idea. This idea of structure and direction is that we always want to affirm created structure, the goodness of creation. So if we're affirming something in culture, it's because it reflects the goodness of God's creation and the goodness of human creativity. That as humans make something, they are being faithful in even making something of God's creation. So we want to affirm the structure, but we also want to criticize or call to repentance the directions that we sometimes respond in. So the fact that I make something in response to God's creation is good, but I might make an idol, right? So I chop down the tree. This is Isaiah 41. Chop down the tree. That's good. I make a fire. That's good. I make an idol. That's bad, right? So I've
Mm.
taken that in two different directions now. And so directional discernment is a matter of asking the question, which direction is this moving? Is it in some sense moving me towards God or away from God, or parts of it moving towards God, reaching for God, looking for God, hungering for God? Um, maybe the cultural artifact stirs up desires it cannot itself fulfill.
Mm.
Um, and in other ways, it might be pulling me away from God, or moving away from God. And this is a very Augustinian idea, is that we both seek God and flee from God at all times, right? And
Mm.
so we are both trying to find God, but also trying to avoid God at all costs. And so directional discernment is not just about saying good or bad, thumbs up, thumbs down to different cultural artifacts, but also looking within cultural artifacts and noticing that there are elements that might be pulling us or stirring up something towards God and also away from God. And then also looking in our hearts and asking, okay, why do I like this? Right. So that's what I always tell my students. The first question of discernment is, why do I resonate with this, or why do I
Mm.
resist it? That's the first step of discernment, is saying, what's going on in my heart? Why do I look at this and I hate it, or I look at this and I'm like, wow, I see something really attractive here. And that's the idea of directional discernment, is saying, how is this moving me? Is it moving me in particular ways towards God and neighbor? Is it moving me to be more focused on myself? That's the sort of process that needs to happen, I think, with cultural engagement and cultural artifacts specifically.
That's helpful. It reminds me of my experience of watching, uh, almost 4 years ago now when Joe Biden came into the White House. When it was the inauguration ceremony, I was watching it and I thought, wow, this is such a beautiful service. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt actually like a worship service
Hmm.
in the way it was kind of framed with, there was singing of Amazing Grace, there was
Scripture quoted, yeah.
poetry, scripture poetry. There was a big speech, which could kind of be like a sermon. And it felt so familiar. And it was promoting this man that we thought would lead us well. And it's like it's almost like I always think of, the president, it's like he's like, maybe this one is our hero. Maybe this one will do it for us, bring the peace we long for. And I think that's common in many political atmospheres that we're looking for a leader who might bring peace, who might bring a way of leading that helps everyone to flourish. And when I think about this directional discernment, I think about that and think about the elections coming up. It's something to think about. It's like, what is that pointing us towards? That desire in us, that hope for a good leader. Because we know from experience, every president has not accomplished that fully, and not it has let us down in different ways. And yet we're longing for that. We long for the Prince of Peace. So that's I just really appreciate that directional discernment, helpful as we consider a variety of topics.
Hmm.
Um, in closing, we just have a few minutes left. You conclude your book with this focus on faith, hope, and love. And you mentioned this kind of near a little bit ago in our conversation about non-reductive curiosity, non-dismissive discernment, and non-anxious presence. And you connect those to the faith, love, and hope virtues. I wondered if you, just for the last few minutes, would be able to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, those three descriptors are my ways they're not synonyms necessarily for faith, hope, and love, but they are, again, dispositions or postures that I think emerge from the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And so we start with the theological virtue of faith, which is a recognition that our security is not found in removing all of our vulnerabilities and knowing all the answers, predicting the future. Uh, that's a way of trying to secure ourselves. But faith reminds us that we can only be secured because somebody is faithful to us. And that posture of faith is a posture of covenantal trust in the God who has revealed himself um, in Israel and in the person of Jesus Christ in his death, burial, and resurrection. And that our this ultimate posture means that we don't actually have to have all the answers, and we don't actually have to be able to predict everything that could happen, because we are not secured that way. And that actually then allows us to be kind of curious, because a lot of times when we think about cultural engagement or the culture, it just feels like everything is at stake all the time. The whole
Mm.
idea of culture war. There's a fog of war that descends on the battlefield when people feel that they're at war. They feel like they are always in danger, harassed, and helpless. But if our ultimate security is not found in our own efforts, but ultimately found in being secured by God, that leads us to a sort of curiosity that we can have of asking questions. I mean, again, it doesn't deny that there is an urgency around various things, but ultimately, our security is not found in what we can accomplish or produce or do in our lifetime. Non-dismissive discernment is the posture that flows from the theological virtue of love, and it's the sense of it's easy for us, I think, to avoid the company of others who don't agree with us,
Mhm.
and to be just very dismissive of them. And if we can dehumanize them, we can dismiss them. And I think it's a reminder that we allow people to take the witness stand. I have a mentor, Rich Mao, who I think I quote in the chapter, and he would always say, Marx is not our judge, Jesus is our judge. And you can fill that gap with anyone. Darwin is not our judge. Nietzsche is not our judge. Whoever it is not our judge. But let's let them take the witness stand. Let's not simply dismiss people's perspective out of hand, even as we acknowledge the fact that Jesus is our ultimate judge. He's the one we answer to. We refuse to dismiss our neighbors, even if they are dismissing us. And then the third virtue is non-anxious presence, which is a phrase that comes from Edwin Friedman, who's a Jewish a psychologist. And this is the idea of hope, right? That flows from hope. Is it's similar to the idea of faith. If our hope that tomorrow could be better than today is not rooted in our cultural success, we can simply be present without the need to win, without the need to be in control, without the need to do anything other than be faithful to who God has called us to be. And we hope, because there is a resurrection, that as we offer our work to the Lord, whatever that is, our prayers, our daily labors, that God will establish the work of our hands, and he will resurrect and take up all of these seeds that we've planted in the harvest of his kingdom. And it's not our job to do that. It's God's job to do that. And so that means that I can relax my shoulders a bit and be less anxious. Maybe being non-anxious is not actually possible, but I can be less anxious and be present in the face of a world I don't always understand, challenges that I'm not sure how to face, because my ultimate hope for the world being made right is that God has promised that he will make it right through Jesus Christ and the Spirit.
Well, that's a great place to finish up our episode. Thank you, Justin, so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it. This is great work you've done.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Travis. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Dr. Justin Bailey on faith and culture. If you enjoyed our conversation, then be sure to like and subscribe, as well as check out the In All Things podcast that Justin hosts. He has had more than 50 conversations with guests including the historian Mark Knoll, the New York Times columnist David French, and author and priest Tish Harrison Warren. As you reflect on our conversation today, I pray that God will fill you with faith, hope, and love as you continue to navigate the complex world we live in as a follower of Jesus Christ. Until next time, take good care.